Hey, do you want to watch a guy get drunk in his car and talk about philosophy? You do? That's what you've always wanted. Oh, great to hear. We'll sit down here in my shitty Honda Fit and we'll get started. So, the reason I wanted to put this video out was because I talk about a lot of heavy shit here on this channel. I talk about philosophy, and I talk about politics, and I talk about ethics, all that good shit. And I think it's probably not clear to a lot of people exactly which perspective I'm coming from, right? Am I a logical positivist? Am I a Christian? Am I an objectivist? Like, what's my sort of fundamental philosophy of like knowledge and meta-ethics? Where are my starting points when I start thinking about these things? And maybe you're not interested in that. I imagine many people wouldn't be. But just in case you are, and for my own sake, I wanted to have laid out my foundational philosophy, where I just build everything from. I'm going to go right down to, how do we know, what is knowledge, all that kind of pretentious shit, but I think that's kind of necessary so that you can get a fuller picture of where I'm coming from. Anyway, so I think when most people start their philosophical journeys, they kick it off with some methodological skepticism, right? Rene Descartes, the Matrix, basically. I was wrong about stuff previously. How do I know I'm not currently wrong about the things that I currently believe? Well, what can I know for sure? Can I even know that I'm holding a bottle right now? Well, I mean, it seems really very much like it, but I could be dreaming, I could be in the Matrix and just think that I'm holding a bottle, but in fact, I'm not. Rene Descartes' original one was the idea is he's put in a trance by a demon, and the demon is feeding him all of these false beliefs, like the belief that he's walking around in the real world, but in fact, everything in his entire life is just a fantasy. There's also some other ways you can sort of consider that perhaps everything you know is wrong, like last Thursdayism gets rid of all previous beliefs. That's the idea that the entire universe was created last Thursday, right? And you might say, well, it doesn't seem like that. I seem to have memories of things before that. There's all this evidence of stuff before that, and yeah, no, it was all created last Thursday, and that just happened and created everything in such a way that it looks like everything's old. Right, and that things happened to them before last Thursday, and the memories of things before last Thursday were actually implanted in you last Thursday. So it's entirely unfalsifiable, but it seems at least plausible that, in the very strictest sense plausible, that before last Thursday there wasn't a universe and it was all created then. So it's this, you get into this sort of position where it's very difficult to justify any beliefs at all. I think that's where a lot of people start their philosophical journey, and Rene Descartes' answer to it is probably most people's answer to it as well, which is, okay, well, there are some things I can know absolutely for sure. The most important one of them, the most important one is cogito ergo sum, which is I think, therefore I am. That's essentially the idea that because we are currently thinking about this, we're asking the question, how do I know what I know? Am I a brain in a vat? Am I in the Matrix? Am I under Rene Descartes' demon's spell? Because we can ask those questions, we must exist in some sense ourselves, right? Because no matter what form we exist in, there must be a thing to ask those questions. And that satisfies most people. But I've always thought this is going to a ridiculous extent, really. Like, we're questioning, is everything I've ever believed and everything I've ever seen, heard, tasted, touched, smelt, is that all fake? It's just every piece of information that I've ever received and built any kind of belief out of, all fake, right? That's pretty extreme. We're really going full bore with the skepticism right there. And while we're doing that, right, if we're accepting that that's what we want to do, we want to be that skeptical, then why not be skeptical of the concept of logic itself? All right, well, maybe contradictory statements are perfectly valid, and so therefore, I think, but I am not, right? And you may say, well, that makes no sense. You can't be thinking if you don't exist. And I just say, well, fucking logic doesn't work. So, yeah, I can. I don't care that doesn't make sense. Origami banana fish spork therefore I think, and yet am not. If logic doesn't work, then all bets are off, and we can start doubting anything René Descartes thought. Incidentally, he also believed that you could justify certain, by definition, true statements like all triangles have three sides. Because that's by definition true. All triangles have three sides. Well, a three-sided shape is part of the definition of triangle, so yeah, that has to be true. There's no way that could be false. Okay. But yeah, so we could just entirely doubt logic itself. So that basically brings us down even further towards philosophical bedrock than René Descartes did. But that's all really dumb, right? Why are we even being skeptical of any of our beliefs in the first place, right? It's because we want some better information to act on. Anytime we do anything, it's because of the beliefs we have. Like, I sit down on this car chair because I believe that there is a chair here for me to sit down on. And if I was wrong about that, then I would fall flat on my butt. That's, that the belief that this chair is here is necessary for me to sit down on it, right? Or for me to take action to sit down on it. I might accidentally do so, but for me to intentionally take action to sit down on it, I need to believe the chair's here. And if I'm wrong about that, then I won't achieve the thing I'm trying to achieve, sitting on this chair, because if it's not there, I won't sit on it. So we need, basically what we're looking for is some way to act in the world, right? So if an answer will make it so that we can't act in the world at all, well then fuck it, right? That we're going to have to assume that one's false, because we're trying to act in the world that we seem to be in here, right? That is the goal. If our philosophy, if our basic assumptions and the philosophy based on them doesn't allow us to act in any way intentionally with any purpose, then fuck that philosophy. That's pointless. Like, we may as well just assume that it's false. Because, if you're going to be that skeptical of everything, why believe that you should believe true things? Maybe you should believe false things. It all gets ridiculous. So any philosophy that doesn't allow us to act in the real world should just be rejected. What I want to do is see if I can just pare that down to the minimum requirements, right? What fundamental assumptions do we have to make before we can actually start acting in the world? Well, first, let's just assume that logic works. That whole thing about, maybe I don't exist. I know that doesn't make sense, but who cares? Logic doesn't work. Herp derp. That's pointless. So we're going to just assume that logic works. Fundamentally, that would just be boiled down to the statement that truth doesn't contradict itself, right? By which I mean that every coherent, specific, and specific proposition about reality is either true or false, and not both. We have an intuitive concept, by the way, of what true and false is. You can't define it any further. Try to define truth right now. I'll take a swig and I'll probably finish this one. And while I'm doing that, define truth. Try to think about it. What does truth mean? Did you find it really difficult? Or did you simply pass the buck to another word? Because that's the only other option. You can say, well, true things and things that are, as opposed to false things which aren't. And it's like, well, that's just passing the buck. That's just like, what is the difference between things that are and aren't? Right? It probably has something to do with the fact that when we think a thing is true, we act on it, right? If I think this chair is here, I attempt to sit down on it. If I think it isn't, I don't. But that's not entirely true. Like, you could at least conceivably act on a false belief intentionally, right? You could, maybe you think that faith in some religion is important for you, and therefore, even if you have no reason to think it's true, I'm going to act as though it does. I'm going to have faith in it, right? Something like that. But you could conceivably act on false beliefs. So even that doesn't really work. The difference between true and false, we're again just going to have to skip over, because there's no way we can boil it down any further. Our basic concept here is that things are either true or false. You can't get any deeper than that, because if you do, well, you're going to start contradicting yourself. Like, maybe things if you want to sort of define truth, you're going to have to say that this definition does apply to that concept. What do you mean does? We have to have some basic concept of truth, and I think we all intuitively do, so we can move on from there. Okay, so, oh yeah, it might be a little bit misleading to say that logic works as our assumption here, because that implies that logic is some rules by which we generate new information where there was none. Logic works simply because we're not entirely always aware of the full implications of the things we're saying. Logic is just a process of making the meaning of our own statements more explicit. I think about classic syllogism. A syllogism is a logically valid form, like premise, conclusion. Classic syllogism, which would be all bachelors are unmarried men, Socrates is an unmarried man, therefore Socrates is a bachelor. Now, that one we can say, yep, that's necessarily true, provided the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Well, that only works because the definition, right, well, let's define the words in all unmarried men are bachelors. Well, define unmarried men for me there. Well, okay, it's a man who doesn't have a wife. Okay, but what, like, could we pare that down even further? Can you just list all of the items which would come under that definition? And you could list them, and you say, okay, so it's equivalent, after you've given that list of every person in the world who would count as a bachelor, as an unmarried man, then one of them would have to be Socrates. And since that list of people is equivalent to unmarried men, then we see that when you say all unmarried men are bachelors, you have already said that Socrates is a bachelor, right? The process of logic, all we did was we made more explicit the things that we've already said. When we say all unmarried men are bachelors, and we include unmarried men in that definition, we include Socrates, then we have already said, even if we don't know it, that Socrates is a bachelor. Okay, so the reason that I'm going to assume that logic works is, that the inverse doesn't work. Right? You can't assume that logic doesn't work because I could just say origami, fish, banana, spork, therefore logic does work. Haha. And in any case, we need to start off. We need some place to get going. It's like my friend Bones the Rabbit. He often says, anything you say after the claim that logic doesn't work may as well just be shitting out of your mouth, because everything you say after that is meaningless. We need logic to have some meaning. In order to have the concept of meaning, we need to assume logic. Okay, so we have some kind of starting point, right? Logic works, aka truth does not contradict itself. AKA, every coherent, specific proposition about reality is either true or false, and not both, and not neither. Oh, by the way, if you're concerned that I might have gerrymandered that a little bit, with the caveats coherent and specific, I want to point out that I only specified it like that in order to avoid criticisms that confuse the words used to convey the proposition with the proposition itself. That was probably a bit confusing, so let me explain. If I say something like, what's that Noam Chomsky thing? Green colorless ideas sleep furiously, right? That is a nonsensical statement, therefore it is not a proposition in any real meaningful sense, right? When I say proposition, I mean some coherent concept that says something about reality, potentially. Right, that's what I'm trying to get at. But the problem is the word proposition can sometimes refer to just a set of words, and I wanted to avoid that. Therefore, I put the caveats specific and coherent in to avoid that. I wasn't gerrymandering. I'm just being clear about what I mean by proposition. Okay, so even with that, though, even with our basic assumption that logic functions, we are only catching up to René Descartes. We still can't act in the world because we might be under René Descartes' demon spell, so it's kind of pointless. Oh, by the way, a common response to René Descartes' demon spell, or are we just in the Matrix, or are we just brains in vats, or things like that, is to say, well, it doesn't matter, we can take the same actions either way, because like they say we are in the Matrix. Okay, well I want my life to be nice in the Matrix then, as opposed to in reality. I don't really see the difference there. But you could always say, well, okay, but we can't tell that we're not in the Matrix, and it's going to end next week if we don't shoot the Malaysian Prime Minister, right? If that could perfectly well be the case, right? We can't prove that that's not the case, and we're going to have to make a decision about that because we need to be able to decide whether we're going to buy some tickets to Malaysia and learn Kung Fu. So what other assumptions are absolutely necessary? What are the minimum additional assumptions that we can make, the most undoubtable ones, in order for us to start acting in reality? Well, we're going to have to assume that our sense data is at least somewhat accurate some of the time, right? If it turns out that all the information we get about reality is wrong, then we can't make a picture of reality. We can't design some concept or some model of reality in our heads on which to act. And so therefore, we're going to have to assume that our sense data is somewhat valid, right? Our goal is to take action in the real world, and only one of those assumptions could conceivably allow us to do so. So therefore, at minimum, we're going to have to assume that we can determine what the world is like to some extent by our sense data, what we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, etc. Right? And that's not to say it will always be correct, right? Maybe this piece of sense data and that piece of sense data will contradict, and we'll have to determine which one's more likely to be true. I would go about that by, so let's say that we see something that we think is a monster in the shadows, but then later on we observe it closer and we see that there's actually just a pile of clothes there in the corner, and we're like, okay, probably that's what we saw and not a monster, right? You can build a consistent picture in your head by just weeding out contradictions in various pieces of sense data in order to come to the most likely conclusion, right? Just following basic things like Occam's razor, right? If we're looking now at some clothes, it's probably simpler that it was always the clothes we saw, since that would explain the shadowy shape we saw. Therefore, we should just assume the clothes rather than add the monster in there as well, right? Because that's an additional thing that we'd be assuming into our picture of the world. You can make, we can use our sense data to construct models of reality. I'm assuming that. I don't think anyone's going to really doubt that, but I just wanted to make really clear why I'm assuming these basic things. Okay, so are we done? Can we now make actions and take our actions in reality? I would argue that we cannot. And the reason is because of something that David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, that was the worst Scottish accent ever. I can usually do a better one, I swear. I'm not going to try, though, so you'll have to believe me or not. Are you going to make that assumption? David Hume is famous for, which is the is-ought distinction, right? In order to say, okay, therefore I'm going to take this action, or I ought to take this action, we need more than just statements about fact, right? Let's say that you say, well, I should eat this pizza because eating this pizza will result in me being full, right? That's a statement about reality. Will eating that pizza sate your hunger? You'll feel full? Well, yes, that is correct about reality. But you're assuming there that there's some value, right? That you value not being hungry. You value having your hunger sated. You can't just make an assumption about reality. You also have to make some basic assumption about your values, like what things you want compared to things you don't want, what things are preferred and not preferred. So in order to act in the real world, we not only need statements about what is, but we also need statements about what ought. Because those ought statements, they can only ever be in order to, right? There's no such thing as an ought statement, like you just fundamentally ought to do that. The only statement that makes sense is like, you ought to do that in order to, right? You ought to eat that pizza in order to sate your hunger, right? Because you can factually tell that, yes, eating that pizza will sate your hunger. So if you value sating your hunger, then you ought to eat the pizza. Right? That's somewhat valid. Jump cut to get another beer. Oof. All right, now let's say that you're with me so far, that you're willing to make those 3 basic assumptions. So, where do we go from there? What can we actually say about reality, and what we ought to do in it, most importantly, based on we should fulfill values, reality can be determined to some extent by our sense data, and logic works, right? What can we actually say that we ought to do from that? I want to focus on 3 things, and these are the 3 things I've managed to get out of these basic assumptions. The first one is the preservation of conscious life. I mean, the source of values is conscious life. If all conscious life disappears, then there's no values to fulfill. We can't fulfill any of them, so nothing good, by the definition that we've developed here, can happen, right? I mean, good, if it means anything, is the things that ought to happen are happening, and we've determined that we must assume that, to some extent, our values ought to be fulfilled, right? Well, then, okay, good should mean fulfillment of values, and no values can be fulfilled if there are no conscious entities to have said values. Okay. We also need to preserve and acquire knowledge, right? We need to acquire new knowledge and see that we can retain it and preserve it. And the reason there is because, well, like I said before, all of our actions are based on the models of reality that we construct, right? So we'll develop some model of reality in our heads, and we'll think about, okay, if I do this or if I do that, what will be the outcome? And we determine which of those outcomes is going to fulfill our values best, and we take that action. That isn't, by the way, always how we do what we do, but that's the important ones. Those are conscious and intentional actions. Those are the things we're dealing with here now. We're not talking about, you got electric shock in a shoulder and you stuck your elbow out. Like, that's the thing you did, I guess, but we're talking about conscious and intentional actions here, right? We have a model in our head of this chair, and therefore we can say, well, I value taking the strain off my legs, and I'm going to sit down on this chair to achieve that. And the knowledge of that chair, the model of reality that includes that chair, is necessary to do so. So therefore, knowledge is necessary for us to take successful actions to achieve the things that we value. Better knowledge, better achievement of the things we value. Okay, so we can definitely say that we want to preserve conscious life, and we want to increase the amount of knowledge that we have, and we want to preserve the knowledge that we already have. Okay, but this is a little bit circular, because we're still not saying, well, how do we actually spend our time in this life other than just preserving life and increasing our knowledge? Like, how do we construct these values? How do we interact with these values, right? How do two people who have different values interact? That, I think, is the key point in my philosophy of ethics. And to that, I turn to a concept known as Pareto efficient behavior. So Pareto efficient behavior, that might sound all fancy-pantsy, but it isn't. It's just voluntary interactions. The reason that it's referred to as Pareto efficient is because necessarily it must improve the current conditions of both of the people, or all of the people, involved in that interaction. Because if it's voluntary, why would someone take part in that interaction unless it was going to improve their position? Now, you might say that, well, okay, I don't think it'll improve their position, right? It's not going to make them, give them sufficient pleasure, right? Like, for example, let's take this beer, right? You might say that, oh, well, I'm just voluntarily deciding to drink this beer. And you might say that that's maybe voluntary, but it's making me actually worse off because I'm, it's going to make me die sooner because it's alcoholic, right? And you want to tell me that, no, it's bad for you. You will be better off without doing it. And sure, you can say that, but that's your set of values, and that is now conflicting with my set of values. Because clearly, if I drink this beer, I think that the effects of this beer, which is going to make me live less long, is worth the effect of the delicious taste and the mental changes that it's going to cause in me. Obviously, I think that's worth it. Right? By definition, I think that's worth it. Right? You might say that, well, we could tell objectively if it is, if we look at your brain and see whether it releases more of endorphins when you drink the beer than when you don't, right? Or something like that, taking into account the fuller extent. But that doesn't really work, right? What do we count as something we value? Because to me, I would say that the things I value are the things I decide I value, right? It doesn't matter what chemicals you've managed to scan in my brain to tell me what I value, but my definition of what I value are the things that I decide that I value, right? It is by definition the things that I act to achieve. I might tell you that I want this thing in the hopes you'll give it to me. I might actively find this thing or buy this thing as it was and drink it because that's what I want, right? To say that, no, it's the amount of endorphins released in your brain or whatever, is to take part of someone's thought process and pretend that's the entire thing. We are machines developed to take in information about the real world and take action based on that. Our thought process is not terminated. We have not completed our thought process until we take action, whether that's speaking, whether that's taking some physical action to take something. We have not completed our thought process until we take an action, and so therefore that which we act to achieve is necessarily that which we value. Okay, so if people who act to achieve something necessarily value that thing, then any voluntary interaction will necessarily provide a benefit to both parties. I'm deciding to take part in this interaction, therefore it benefits me. He is as well, therefore it benefits him. We can say this we can take into account a trade, for example. Like, here's some headphones, and here's a beer. Let's say you have the headphones, I have the beer. Now, I say, hey, do you want to trade those headphones for this beer? And we do that. Now, obviously, I value the headphones more than I value the beer. And you value the beer more than you value the headphones. Necessarily, that must be the case, right? The fact that you are willing to give up these headphones for the beer means that you must value the beer more than the headphones. The fact that I'm willing to give up this beer for these headphones means that I must value the headphones more than the beer. So we trade. Now, as it happens, I actually value the beer more. This is for illustrative purposes. So, any voluntary interaction necessarily improves the condition of everyone involved. A forced interaction may not. I may be forced to do something, right? You may impose some conditions on me which reduce my overall level of fulfillment, which reduce which values of mine are fulfilled, right? You might put a gun to my head, for example, and say, I'm going to reduce the fulfillment of your values by killing you, something you value not happening, if you don't give me your beer, right? That's now not a voluntary interaction. You have the fact that when I give up my beer to you, that does improve my condition, because obviously I've decided to give up my beer to you. I value that more than I value not dying. But the part that is making everything worse is when you actually shoot me in the head, or when you threaten to, really. But no, when you shoot me in the head, that makes everything worse. So that is a non-voluntary interaction. It's where you impose conditions upon me which make my situation worse, and therefore I act to make it better than it otherwise would be, but still worse than it would have been if you hadn't done that. So, okay, there are situations that are Pareto efficient. Basically, everyone is taking part in everything voluntarily, and there are situations that are not, that are involuntary and therefore make the world worse. Fewer values are fulfilled. All right, So those are the three basic things that we can say are necessarily good. We can say that preservation of consciousness is good, the acquisition and retention of knowledge is good, and Pareto efficient behavior is good. However, there is one thing about that last one, the Pareto efficient behavior, that I want to point out because it's kind of important. And that is that it implies property rights. A lot of people who are on the more communistic side of things, they might not like this, but they agree with that too. Let's say that we both have a need for this beer. You want to drink the beer, I want to drink the beer, and we both value having drunk the beer. Which one of us gets our values fulfilled? This seems like it's going to be a problem. We clearly cannot have a Pareto efficient interaction here, right? Because we both want this beer. So therefore, someone is going to have their values fulfilled and someone else will not. That is how I define ownership, right? The person who gets to determine what happens to the thing owns that thing. Now, what systems could we have for owning this thing? If you're a communist, you might say no one owns it, but really you think we should vote on it, which means you think that everyone in your communist collective owns it, right? Presumably. Okay, let's say that you think that, well, no, everyone should own it, right? It's all owned and we all vote on it. Okay, what if I subvert your society to create a capitalistic society, right? What if we all vote to sell it to someone and then that person is to henceforth exclusively own it? It's private property now. Well, no, you say, we can't do that. All right, so there is some subsection of people, the people who believe in communism, who get to determine what happens to things. Right, you believe in ownership then. You believe that this group of people gets to determine what happens to the thing, and outsiders do not. Now, how do we maximize Pareto efficient behavior? Voluntary interactions. I would say that the way you do that is by assigning property rights to whoever is the first person to utilize a thing, or whoever acquires that thing voluntarily in a Pareto efficient interaction. So that is to say, the first person who, I probably can't use beer in this example, an apple on a tree, right? I find an apple on a tree and I pick it and I've taken that off the tree and now I'm the first person to acquire that thing, to start using that thing. And before I eat it, if someone else comes and takes it from me, I think we should consider that wrong. We should consider that apple mine, because the first person to interact with that thing ought to be the owner. Now, the reason that I say it should be the first person is because let's consider the alternative. Should it be the second person? No, because that's going to create a conflict, because I've just taken this thing and I'm about to eat it and you're going to try to take it from me, right? And now we have a non-Pareto efficient interaction. Right. So the only way to make sure that we're maximizing values successfully and constantly is by saying that the first person to interact with an item is the one who owns it. However, keep in mind that this is not a fundamental rule of logic, right? I'm not saying that there's some deontological maxim which requires that we give the ownership, that we respect the ownership of the first person to interact with something. This is a strategy. I believe the only valid strategy to ensuring more Pareto efficient behavior. So if you were to say, well, what about, the air? I breathed in a little bit of air. Do I own all the air on Earth? Like, how much air do I own now? And so, well, that's not really going to work. The strategy breaks down there, but that's fine. It's just a strategy. Right, it's just a way of getting us to more Pareto efficient behavior, more values fulfilled. Right, we need more voluntary interactions, because that's the only way we can be totally sure that we're improving the world, when the interaction is voluntary. So we want more interactions to be voluntary, and we need to assign property rights to do it. And the only way to have property rights that ensure said Pareto efficient behavior maximally is to, in most cases, whenever there's some scarce good that we can reasonably assign property rights to, is to assign it to the first person to interact with it, or the people who acquire that property in Pareto efficient voluntary interactions, right? You sell it to me, for example, right? Maybe I pick that apple off the tree and you decide to buy it and I'm willing to sell it to you. That's fine too, right? Because me picking the apple, Pareto efficient, you trading the apple for money, Pareto efficient, it's all fine. And I think that's probably where I'm going to end, because it's getting pretty late and I'm getting pretty drunk. And I imagine there's all of like 4 people still watching. But yeah, that's essentially where I come from in terms of ethics. It's sort of utilitarian in the sense that I want to maximize the fulfillment of values, but it's realistic in terms of how we can actually determine the values that can be fulfilled. I don't think that we can sort of calculate values. There's no fundamental unit of values. There's just like rankings of possible futures. Like, I value this thing more than that thing, more than that thing, and we can't tell if my valuing this thing is more important or less important than your valuing of this thing. So we're going to need just to only take part in interactions that maximize the valuation between us, in the sense that it improves both of our situations in terms of our values fulfilled. I'm like a consequentialist. Call me the realistic utilitarian. Right? I believe in maximizing total value, but I don't think that that's particularly calculable. So therefore, I resort to libertarian property rights theory, essentially. And that's where I'm coming from. Thanks to everyone who actually sat through this. I had a lot of fun making this. I love this nerdy philosophical shit. Please upvote this so that I have an excuse to make more of them. And yeah, get the hell out of my shitty Honda Fit.